Chapter 4. The Error in the Marxian System, Its Origin and Ramifications. Section 1. The evidence that an author has contradicted himself may be a necessary stage, but it cannot be the ultimate aim of a fruitful and well-directed criticism. To be aware that there is a deficit in a system which may possibly be accidental only and peculiar to the author requires a comparatively low degree of critical intelligence. A firmly rooted system can only be effectually overthrown by discovering with absolute precision the point at which the error made its way into the system and the manner in which it spread and branched itself out. As opponents, we ought to study the beginning, the development, and the final use of the error, which culminates in self-contradiction, as thoroughly, I might also say as sympathetically, as we would study the connection of a system with which we were in agreement. Owing to many peculiar circumstances, the question of self-contradiction has, in the case of Marx, gained a more than ordinary importance, and consequently, I have devoted a considerable space to it. But in dealing with a thinker so important and influential as Marx, it is incumbent upon us to apply ourselves to the second, and in this case, I think, the actually more fruitful and instructive part of the criticism. We will begin with a question which will carry us straight to the main point. In what way did Marx arrive at the fundamental proposition of his teaching, the proposition that all value depends solely on incorporated quantities of labor? This proposition is not a self-evident axiom, needing no proof, is beyond doubt. Value and effort, as I have stated at length in other places, are not ideas so intimately connected that one is forced immediately to adopt the view that effort is the basis of value. Quote, "That I have toiled over a thing is one fact, that the thing is worth the toil is another, and a different fact that the two facts do not always go hand in hand is so far too firmly established by experience to admit of any doubt. It is proved by all that labor which is daily wasted on valueless results, owing either to want of technical skill or to bad speculation or to simple misfortune, and not less by each of the numerous cases in which a very little toil has a result of very great value." End quote. Böhm-Bawerk, Capital and Interest. When therefore it is affirmed that a necessary and natural correspondence between value and effort exists in any quarter, it behooves us to give ourselves and our readers some grounds in support of such a statement. Now Marx himself advances proofs of it in his system, but I think I shall be able to convince my readers that from the outset his line of argument is unnatural and not suited to the character of the problem, and further that the evidence which Marx advances in his system is clearly not the same as that by means of which he himself arrives at his convictions, but was thought out subsequently as an artificial support for an opinion which was previously derived from other sources, and finally, and this is the most decisive point, that the reasoning is full of the most obvious faults of logic and method which deprive it of all cogency. Let us examine this more closely. The fundamental proposition which Marx puts before his readers is that the exchange value of commodities, for his analysis is directly and only at this, not to value and use, finds its origin and its measure in the quantity of labor incorporated in the commodities. Now it is certain that the exchange values, that is to say, the prices of the commodities as well as the quantities of labor which are necessary for their reproduction, are real external quantities which on the whole it is quite possible to determine empirically. Obviously, therefore, Marx ought to have turned to experience for the proof of a proposition, the correctness or incorrectness of which must be manifested in the facts of experience, or in other words, he should have given a purely empirical proof in support of a proposition adapted to a purely empirical proof. This, however, Marx does not do, and one cannot even say that he heedlessly passes by this possible and certainly proper source of knowledge and conviction. The reasoning of the third volume proves that he was quite aware of the nature of the empirical facts and that they were opposed to his proposition. He knew that the prices of commodities were not in proportion to the amount of incorporated labor, but to the total cost of production, which comprises other elements besides. He did not therefore accidentally overlook this, the most natural proof of his proposition, but turned away from it, with the full consciousness that upon this road no issue favorable to his theory could be obtained. But there is yet another and perfectly natural way of testing and proving such propositions, the psychological. We can, by a combination of induction and deduction, much used in our science, investigate the motives which direct people in carrying on the business of exchange and in determining exchange prices on the one hand, and on the other hand, which guide them in their cooperation in production, and from the nature of these motives a typical mode of action may be inferred, through which, among other things, it is conceivable that a connection should result between the regularly demanded and accepted prices and the quantity of work necessary for the production of the commodities. This method has often been followed with the best results in exactly similar questions. For instance, the usual justification of the law of supply and demand, and of the law of costs of production, and the explanation of ground rents rests upon it. And Marx himself, in a general way at least, has often made use of it, but precisely in dealing with his fundamental proposition he avoids it. Although obviously the affirmed external connection between exchange relations and quantities of work could only be fully understood by the discovery of the psychological links which connect the two, he forgoes all explanation of these internal connections. He even once says, incidentally, that, quote, the deeper analysis, end quote, of the two social forces, quote, demand and supply, end quote, which would have led to this internal connection is, quote, not apposite here, end quote, capital volume 3, where the, quote, here, end quote, only refers to a digression on the influence of supply and demand on the formation of prices. In reality, however, nowhere in the whole Marxian system is a really, quote, deep, end quote, and thorough analysis attempted, and the absence of this analysis is most notable where he is preparing the ground for his most important leading idea. But here again we notice something strange. Marx does not, as might have been expected, pass over this second possible and natural method of investigation with an easy carelessness. He studiously avoids it, and with a full consciousness of what the results of following it would be, and that they would not be favorable to his thesis. He studiously avoids it, and with a full consciousness of what the results of following it would be, and that they would not be favorable to his thesis. In the third volume, for instance, he actually brings forward, under their roughly collective name of, quote, competition, end quote, those motives operative in production and exchange, the, quote, deeper analysis, end quote, of which he forgoes here and elsewhere, and demonstrates that these motives do not in reality lead to an adjustment of prices to the quantities of labor incorporated in the commodities, but that, on the contrary, they force them away from this level to a level which implies at least one other coordinating factor. Indeed, it is competition which, according to Marx, leads to the formation of the celebrated average rate of profit and the, quote, transfer, end quote, of pure labor values into prices of production, which differ from them and contain a portion of average profit. Now, Marx, instead of proving his thesis from experience or from its operant motives, that is, empirically or psychologically, prefers another, and for such a subject, somewhat singular line of evidence, the method of a purely logical proof, a dialectic deduction from the very nature of exchange. Marx had found in old Aristotle the idea that, quote, exchange cannot exist without equality, and equality cannot exist without commensurability, end quote. Starting with this idea, he expands it. He conceives the exchange of two commodities under the form of an equation, and from this infers that, quote, a common factor of the same amount, end quote, must exist in the things exchanged, and thereby equated, and then proceeds to search for this common factor to which the two equated things must as exchange values be, quote, reducible, end quote. I should like to remark, that's Capital Volume 1. I should like to remark in passing that the first assumption, according to which a, quote, equality, end quote, must be manifested in the exchange of two things, appears to me to be very old-fashioned, which would not, however, matter much were it not also very unrealistic. In plain words, it seems to me to be a wrong idea. Where equality and exact equilibrium obtain, no change is likely to occur to disturb the balance. When, therefore, in the case of exchange, the matter determines with a change of ownership of the commodities, it points rather to the existence of some inequality or preponderance which produces the alteration. When composite bodies are brought into close contact with each other, new chemical combinations are produced by some of the constituent elements of one body uniting with those of another body, not because they possess an exactly equal degree of chemical affinity, but because they have a stronger affinity with each other than with the other elements of the bodies to which they originally belonged. And as a matter of fact, modern political economists agree that the old scholastico-theological theory of, quote, equivalence, end quote, in the commodities to be exchanged is untenable. I will not, however, dwell any longer on this point, but will proceed to the critical investigation of the logical and systematic processes of distillation by means of which Marx obtains the sought-for, quote, common factor, end quote, in labor. It is these processes which appear to me to constitute, as I have said before, the most vulnerable point in the Marxian theory. They exhibit as many cardinal errors as there are points in the arguments, of which there are not a few, and they bear evident traces of having been a subtle and artificial afterthought contrived to make a preconceived opinion seem the natural outcome of a prolonged investigation. Marx searches for the, quote, common factor, end quote, which is the characteristic of exchange value in the following way. Marx passes in review the various properties possessed by the objects made equal in exchange, and according to the method of exclusion separates all those which cannot stand the test, until at last only one property remains, that of being the product of labor. This, therefore, must be the sought-for common property. This line of procedure is somewhat singular, but not in itself objectionable. It strikes one as strange that instead of submitting the supposed characteristic property to a positive test, as would have been done if either of the other methods studiously avoided by Marx had been employed, Marx tries to convince us that he has found the sought-for property by a purely negative proof, by showing that it is not any of the other properties. This method can always lead to the desired end if attention and thoroughness are used, that is to say, if extreme care is taken that everything that ought to be included is actually passed through the logical sieve, and that no mistake has been made in leaving anything out. But how does Marx proceed? From the beginning, he only puts into the sieve those exchangeable things which contain the property which he desires finally to sift out. From the beginning, he only puts into the sieve those exchangeable things which contain the property which he desires finally to sift out as the, quote, common factor, end quote, and he leaves all the others outside. He acts as one who, urgently desiring to bring a white ball out of an urn, takes care to secure this result by putting in white balls only. That is to say, he limits from the outset the field of his search for the substance of the exchange value to, quote, commodities, end quote, and in doing so he forms a conception with a meaning narrower than the conception of, quote, goods, end quote, though he does not clearly define it, and limits it to products of labor as against gifts of nature. Now it stands to reason that if exchange really means an equalization, which assumes the existence of a, quote, common factor of the same amount, end quote, this common factor must be sought and found in every species of goods which is brought into exchange, not only in products of labor, but also in gifts of nature such as the soil, wood and trees, water, power, coal beds, stone quarries, petroleum reserves, mineral waters, gold mines, etc. To exclude the exchangeable goods which are not products of labor, in the search for the common factor which lies at the root of exchange value is, under the circumstances, a great error of method. It is just as though a natural philosopher, desiring to discover a property common to all bodies, weight, for instance, were to sift the properties of a single group of bodies, transparent bodies, for instance, and after passing in review all the properties common to transparent bodies, were to declare that transparency must be the cause of weight, for the sole reason that he could demonstrate that it could not be caused by any of the other properties. The exclusion of the gifts of nature, which would never have entered the head of Aristotle, the father of the idea of equality and exchange, is the less to be justified because many natural gifts, such as the soil, are among the most important objects of property and commerce, and also because it is impossible to affirm that in nature's gifts exchange values are always established arbitrarily and by accident. On the other hand, there are such things as accidental prices among products of labor. On the other hand, the prices in the case of nature's gifts are frequently shown to be strictly related to antecedent conditions or determining motives. For instance, that the sale price of land is a multiple of its rent calculated on an interest usual in the country of sale is a well-known fact, as that the wood in a tree or the coal in a pit brings a higher or lower price according to differences of quality or of distance from market, and not by mere accident. Marx also takes care to avoid mentioning or explaining the fact that he excludes from his investigation a part of exchangeable goods. In this case, as in many others, he manages to glide with dialectic skill over the difficult points of his argument. He omits to call his reader's attention to the fact that his ideas of, quote, commodities, end quote, is narrower than that of exchangeable goods as a whole. He very cleverly prepares us for the acceptance of the subsequent limitation of the investigation to commodities by placing at the beginning of his book the apparently harmless general phrase that the, quote, wealth of societies in which a capitalist system of production is dominant appears as an immense collection of commodities, end quote. This proposition is quite wrong if we take the term, quote, commodity, end quote, to mean products of labor, which is the sense Marx subsequently gives to it. For the gifts of nature, inclusive of the soil, constitute by no means insignificant, but on the contrary a very important element of national wealth. The ingenuous reader easily overlooks this inaccuracy. The ingenuous reader easily overlooks this inaccuracy, however, for of course he does not know the later Marx will give a much more restricted meaning to the term, quote, commodity, end quote. Nor is this made clear in what immediately follows. On the contrary, in the first paragraphs of the first chapter, we read in terms of a, quote, thing, end quote, a, quote, value in use, end quote, a, quote, good, end quote, and a, quote, commodity, end quote, without any clear distinction being made between the last and the three former. Quote, the usefulness of a thing, end quote, it says on page 42, quote, makes it a value in use, end quote. Quote, the commodity is value in use or good, end quote. On page 43 we read, quote, exchange value appears as the quantitative proportion in which values in use of one kind exchange with values in use of another kind, end quote. And here let it be noticed that it is just the value in use equal to good, which is still directly indicated as the main factor of the exchange phenomenon. And with the phrase, quote, let us look into the matter more closely, end quote, which surely cannot be meant to prepare us for a leap into another and a narrower field of research, Marx continues, quote, a single commodity, a quarter of wheat for instance, exchanges in the most varying proportions with other articles, end quote. End quote, let us further take two commodities, end quote, etc. In the same paragraph, the term, quote, things occurs again. And indeed with the application which is most important for the problem, namely, quote, that a common factor of equal amount exists in two different things, end quote, which are made equal to each other in exchange. On the next page, however, Marx directs his search for the, quote, common factor, end quote, only to the, quote, exchange value of commodities, end quote, without hinting even in the faintest whisper that he has thereby limited the field of research to a part only of the things possessing exchange value. And immediately on the next page, the limitation is again abandoned, and the results just obtained in the narrower area are applied to the wider sphere of values in use or goods. Quote, a value in use, or a good, has therefore only a value because abstract human labor is stored up or materialized in it, end quote. If Marx had not confined his research at the decisive point to products of labor, but had sought for the common factor in the exchangeable gifts of nature as well, it would have become obvious that work cannot be the common factor. If he had carried out this limitation quite clearly and openly, this gross fallacy of method would inevitably have struck both himself and his readers, and they would have been forced to laugh at the naive juggle by means of which the property of being a product of labor has been successfully distilled out as the common property of a group from which all exchangeable things which naturally belong to it and which are not the products of labor have been first of all eliminated. The trick could only have been performed as Marx performed it by gliding unnoticed over the knotty point with a light and a quick dialectic. But while I express my sincere admiration of the skill and with which Marx managed to present so faulty a mode of procedure in so specious a form, I can of course only maintain that the proceeding itself is altogether erroneous. But we will proceed. By means of the artifice just described, Marx has merely succeeded in convincing us that labor can in fact enter into the competition. And it was only by the artificial narrowing of the sphere that it could even have become one, quote, common, end quote, property of this narrow sphere. But by its side, other properties could claim to be as common. How now is the exclusion of these other competitors effected? It is effected by two arguments, each of a few words only, but which contain one of the most serious of logical fallacies. In the first of these, Marx excludes, quote, all geometrical, physical, chemical, or other natural properties of the commodities, end quote. For, quote, their physical properties are only come into consideration insofar as they make the commodities useful, make them values in use, therefore. On the other hand, the exchange relation of commodities evidently involves our disregarding their values in use, because, quote, within this relation, the exchange relation, one value in use is worth exactly as much as every other, provided only it is present in proper proportions, end quote. Capital Volume 1. In making clear what this argument involves, I may be permitted to quote from my Capital and Interest. Quote, what would Marx have said to the following argument? In an opera company, there are three celebrated singers, a tenor, a bass, and a baritone, each with a salary of £2,000. Someone asks, quote, what is the common circumstance on account of which their salaries are made equal, end quote. And I answer, quote, in the question of salary, one good voice counts for just as much as any other, a good tenor for as much as a good bass, or a good baritone, provided only it is to be had in proper proportion. Consequently, in the question of salary, the good voice is evidently disregarded, and the good voice cannot be the common cause of the high salary, end quote. Böhm-Bawerk, Capital and Interest. That this argument is false is clear, but it is just as clear that Marx's syllogism from which this is copied is not an atom more correct. Both commit the same fallacy. They confuse abstraction from the genus, and abstraction from the specific forms in which the genus manifests itself. In our illustration, the circumstance which is of no account as regards the question of salary is evidently only the special form in which the good voice appears, whether as tenor, bass, or baritone, and by no means the good voice as such. And just so is it with the exchange relation of commodities. The special forms under which the values and use of the commodities may appear, whether they serve as food, shelter, clothing, etc., is of course disregarded, but the value and use of the commodity as such is never disregarded. Marx might have seen that we do not absolutely disregard value and use from the fact that there can be no exchange value where there is no value in use, a fact which Marx himself is repeatedly forced to admit, end quote. Böhm-Bawerk, Capital and Interest. The second step in the argument is still worse. Quote, if the use value of commodities be disregarded, end quote, these are Marx's words, quote, there remains in them only one other property, that of being products of labor, end quote. Is it so? I ask today, as I asked 12 years ago, is there only one other property? Is not the property of being scarce in proportion to demand also common to all exchangeable goods, or that they are the subjects of demand and supply, or that they are appropriated, or that they are natural products, for that they are products of nature, just as they are products of labor? No one asserts more plainly than Marx himself when he declares in one place that, quote, commodities are combinations of two elements, natural material and labor, end quote. Or is not the property that they cause expense to their producers a property to which Marx draws attention in the third volume, common to exchangeable goods. Why, then, I ask, again today, may not the principle of value reside in any one of these common properties, as well as in the property of being products of labor? For in support of this latter proposition, Marx had not adduced a shred of positive evidence. His sole argument is the negative one, and that the value and use from which we have happily abstracted is not the principle of exchange value. But does not this negative argument apply equally to all the other common properties overlooked by Marx? And this is not all. On page 44, in which Marx has abstracted from the influence of the value and use on exchange value, by arguing that any one value and use is worth as much as any other, if only it is present in proper proportion, he writes as follows about products of labor. Quote, "But even as the product of labor, they have already changed in our hand. For if we abstract from a commodity in its value and use, we at the same time take from it the material constituents and forms which give it a value and use. It is no longer a table or a house or yarn or any other useful thing. All its physical properties have disappeared, nor is it any longer the product of the labor of the carpenter or the mason or the spinner or of any other particular productive industry. With the useful character of the labor products, there disappears the useful character of the labor embodied in them, and there vanishes also the different concrete forms of those labors. They are no longer distinguished from each other, but are all reduced to identical human labor. Abstract human labor." End quote. Is it possible to state more clearly? That quote was from Capital Volume 1. It is possible to state more clearly or more emphatically that for an exchange relation, not only any one value in use, but also any one kind of labor or product of labor is worth exactly as much as any other, if only it is present in proper proportion, or in other words, that exactly the same evidence on which Marx formulated his verdict of exclusion against the value in use holds good with regard to labor. Labor and value in use have a qualitative side and a quantitative side. As the value in use is different qualitatively as table, house, or yarn, so is labor as carpentry, masonry, or spinning. And just as one can compare different kinds of labor according to their quantity, so one can compare values and use of different kinds according to the amount of value in use. It is quite impossible to understand why the very same evidence should result in one competitor being excluded and in the other getting the crown and the prize. If Marx had chanced in reverse the order of the examination, the same reasoning which led to the exclusion of the value in use would have excluded labor, and then the reasoning which resulted in the crowning of labor might have led him to declare the value in use to be the only property left, and therefore to be the sought-for common property, and value to be, quote, "the cellular tissue of value in use," end quote. I think it can be maintained seriously, not in jest, that if the subjects of the two paragraphs on page 44 were transposed, in the first of which the influence of value in use is thought away, and in the second labor is shown to be the sought-for common factor, the seeming justness of reasoning would not be affected, that, quote, labor, end quote, and, quote, products of labor, end quote, could be substituted everywhere for, quote, value in use, end quote, in the other unaltered structure of the first paragraph, and that in the structure of the second paragraph, value in use could be substituted throughout for, quote, labor, end quote. Of such a nature are the reasoning and the method employed by Marx in introducing into his system his fundamental proposition that labor is the sole basis of value. In my opinion, it is quite impossible that this dialectical hocus-pocus constituted the ground and source of Marx's own convictions. It would have been impossible for a thinker such as he was, and I look upon him as an intellectual force of the very highest order, to have followed such tortuous and unnatural methods had he been engaged with a free and open mind in really investigating the actual connections of things and in forming his own conclusions with regard to them. It would have been impossible for him to fall successively by mere accident into all the errors of thought and method which I have described, and to arrive at the conclusion that labor is the sole source of value as the natural outgrowth, not the desired and predetermined result of such a mode of inquiry. I think the case was really different. That Marx was truly and honestly convinced of the truth of his thesis, I do not doubt. But the grounds of his conviction are not those which he gives in his system. They are in reality opinions rather than thought-out conclusions. Above all, they were opinions derived from authority. Smith and Ricardo, the great authorities, as was then at least believed, had taught the same doctrine. They had not proved that doctrine any more than Marx. They had only postulated it from certain general confused impressions, but they explicitly contradicted it when they examined things more closely and in quarters where a closer examination could not be avoided. Smith, in the same way as Marx in his third volume, taught that in a developed economic system, values and prices gravitate towards a level of cost which, besides labor, comprises an average rate of profit. And Ricardo, too, in the celebrated fourth section of the chapter on value, clearly and immediately stated that by the side of labor, immediate or immediate, the amount of capital invested and the duration of the investment exercise a determining influence on the value of the goods. In order to maintain without obvious contradictions their cherished philosophical principle that labor is the, quote, true, end quote, source of value, they were obliged to beat a retreat to mythical times and places in which capitalists and landed proprietors did not exist. There they could maintain it without contradiction, for there was nothing to restrain them. Experience which does not support the theory was not there to refute them, nor were they restrained by a scientific psychological analysis, for like Marx they avoided such an analysis. They did not seek to prove, they postulated, as a, quote, natural, end quote, state, an idyllic state of things where labor and value were one. It was to tendencies and views of this kind which had acquired from Smith and Ricardo a great but not undisputed authority that Marx became heir, and as an ardent socialist he willingly believed in them. It is not surprising that he did not take a more skeptical attitude with regard to a view which was so well adapted to support his economic theory of the world than did Ricardo, to whom it must have gone sorely against the grain. It is not surprising, too, that he did not allow those views of the classical writers which were against him to excite any critical doubts in his own mind on the doctrine that value is wholly labor, but considered that they were only attempts on their part to escape in an indirect way from the unpleasant consequences of an inconvenient truth. In short, it is not surprising that the same material on which the classical writers had grounded their half-confused, half-contradictory, and wholly unproved opinions might have served Marx as foundation for the same assumption, believed in unconditionally and with earnest conviction. For himself he needed no further evidence, only for his system he needed a formal proof. It is clear that he could not rely simply on the classical writers for this, as they had not proved anything, and we also know that he could not appeal to experience or attempt at economic psychological proof, for these methods would have straightway led him to a conclusion exactly opposite to the one he wished to establish. So he turned to dialectical speculation, which was moreover in keeping with the bent of his mind. And here it was a question of using by any means at hand. He knew the result that he wished to obtain and must obtain, and so he twisted and manipulated the long-suffering ideas and logical premises with admirable skill and subtlety until they actually yielded the desired result in a seemingly respectable syllogistic form. Perhaps he was so blinded by his convictions that he was not aware of the monstrosities of logic and method which had necessarily crept in, or perhaps he was aware of them and thought himself justified in making use of them simply as formal supports to give a suitable systematic dress to a truth which, according to his deepest convictions, was already substantially proved. Of that I cannot judge, neither is it now possible for anyone else to do so. What I will say, however, is that no one with so powerful a mind as Marx has ever exhibited a logic so continuously and so palpably wrong as he exhibits in the systematic proof of his fundamental doctrine. Section 2. This wrong thesis he now weaves into his system with admirable tactical skill. Of this we have a brilliant example in the next step he takes. Although he has carefully steered clear of the testimony of experience and has evolved his doctrine entirely, quote, out of the depths of his mind, end quote, yet the wish to apply the test of experience cannot be altogether suppressed. If Marx himself would not do it, his readers would certainly do it on their own account. What does he do? He divides and distinguishes. At one point, the disagreement between his doctrine and experience is flagrant. Not fragrant. Taking the bull by the horns, he himself seizes upon this point. He had stated as a consequence of his fundamental principle that the value of different commodities is in proportion to the working time necessary to their production. Now it is obvious even to the casual observer that this proposition cannot maintain itself in the face of certain facts. The day's product of a sculptor or a cabinet maker, of a violin maker, of an engineer, etc., certainly does not contain an equal value, but a much higher value than the day's product of a common workman or factory hand, although in both the same amount of working time is, quote, embodied, end quote. Marx himself, with a masterly dialectic, now brings these facts up for discussion, and considering them, he seeks to suggest that they do not contain a contradiction of his fundamental principle, but are only a slightly different reading of it which still comes within limits of the rule, and that all that is needed is some explanation or more exact definition of the latter. That is to say, he declares that labor in the sense of his proposition means the, quote, expenditure of simple unskilled labor power, an average of which is possessed in his physical organism by every ordinary man without special cultivation, end quote. Or in other words, quote, simple average labor, end quote, capital volume 1. Quote, skilled labor, end quote, Marx continues, quote, counts only as concentrated or rather multiplied unskilled labor, so that a small quantity of skilled labor is equal to a larger quantity of unskilled labor. That this reduction is constantly made, experience shows. A commodity may be the product of the most highly skilled labor, but the commodity's value makes it equal to the product of unskilled labor and represents, therefore, only a definite quantity of unskilled labor. The different proportions in which different kinds of labor are reduced to unskilled labor as their unit of measure are fixed by a social process beyond the control of the producers, and therefore seem given to them by tradition, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. This explanation may really sound quite plausible to the hasty reader, but if we look at it coolly and soberly, we get quite a different impression. The fact with which we have to deal with is that the product of a day or an hour's skilled labor is more valuable than the product of a day or an hour's unskilled labor. That, for instance, the day's product of a sculptor is equal to the 5 days' product of a stonebreaker. Now Marx tells us that things made equal to each other in exchange must contain, quote, a common factor of the same amount, end quote. And this common factor must be labor and working time. Does he mean labor in general? Marx's first statements up to page 45 would lead us to suppose so. But it is evident that something is wrong, for the labor of 5 days is obviously not, quote, the same amount, end quote, as the labor of 1 day. Therefore, Marx, in the case before us, is no longer speaking of labor as such, but of unskilled labor. The common factor must therefore be the possession of an unequal amount of labor of a particular kind, namely unskilled labor. If we look at this dispassionately, however, it fits still worse, for in sculpture there is no, quote, unskilled labor, end quote, at all embodied, much less, therefore, unskilled labor equal to the amount in the 5 days' labor of the stonebreaker. The plain truth is that the two products embody different kinds of labor in different amounts, and every unprejudiced person will admit that this means a state of things exactly contrary to the conditions which Marx demands and must affirm, namely, that they embody labor of the same kind and of the same amount. Marx certainly says that skilled labor, quote, counts, end quote, as multiplied unskilled labor. But to, quote, count as, end quote, is not, quote, to be, end quote, and the theory deals with the being of things. Men may naturally consider 1 day of a sculptor's work as equal in some respects to 5 days of a stonebreaker's work, just as they may also consider a deer as equal to 5 hares. But a statistician might with equal justification maintain with scientific conviction that there were 1,000 hares in a cover which contained 100 deer and 500 hares. As a statistician of prices or a theorist about value might seriously maintain that in the day's product of a sculptor, 5 days of unskilled labor are embodied, and that is the true reason why it is considered in exchange to be equal in 5 days' labor of a stonebreaker. I will presently attempt to illustrate by an example bearing directly on the problem of value the multitude of things we might prove if we resorted to the verb, quote, to count, end quote, whenever the verb, quote, to be landed us in difficulties. But I must first add one other criticism. Marx makes an attempt in the passage quoted to justify his maneuver of reducing skilled labor to common labor and to justify it by experience. Quote, that this reduction is constantly made, experience shows. A commodity may be the product of the most highly skilled labor, but its value makes it equal to the product of unskilled labor, and represents therefore only a definite quantity of unskilled labor, end quote. Good. We will let that pass for the moment, and will only inquire a little more closely in what manner and by what means we are to determine the standard of this reduction, which according to Marx, experience shows is constantly made. Here we stumble against the very natural, but for the Marxian theory, the very compromising circumstance that the standard of reduction is determined solely by the actual exchange relations themselves. But in what proportion skilled is to be translated into terms of simple labor in the valuation of their products is not determined, nor can it be determined a priori by any property inherent in the skilled labor itself. But it is the actual result alone which decides the actual exchange relations. Marx himself says, quote, their value makes them equal to the product of unskilled labor, end quote, and he refers to a, quote, social process beyond the control of the producers, which fixes the proportions in which different kinds of labor are reduced to unskilled labor as their unit of measure, end quote. And says that these proportions, therefore, quote, seem to be given by tradition, end quote. Under these circumstances, what is the meaning of the appeal to, quote, value and the, quote, social process as the determining factors of the standard of reduction? Apart from everything else, it simply means that Marx is arguing in a complete circle. The real subject of inquiry is the exchange relations of commodities. Why, for instance, a statuette which has cost a sculptor 1 day's labor should exchange for a cart of stones which has cost a stonebreaker 5 days' labor, and not for a larger or smaller quantity of stones, in the breaking of which 10 or 3 days' labor have been expended. How does Marx explain this? He says the exchange relation is this and no other, because 1 day of sculptor's work is reducible exactly to 5 days of unskilled labor. And why is it reducible to exactly 5 days? Because experience shows that it is so reduced by a social process. And what is this social process? The same process that has to be explained, that very process by means of which the product of 1 day of sculptor's labor has been made equal to the value of the product of 5 days of common labor. But if, as a matter of fact, it were exchanged regularly against the product of only 3 days of simple labor, Marx would equally bid us accept the rate of reduction of 1 to 3 as the one derived from experience, and would found upon it and explain it. But if, as a matter of fact, it were exchanged regularly against the product of only 3 days of simple labor, Marx would equally bid us accept the rate of reduction of 1 to 3 as the one derived from experience, and would found upon it and explain it by it the assertion that a statuette must be equal in exchange to the product of exactly 3 days of a stonebreaker's work, not more and not less. In short, it is clear that we shall never learn in this way the actual reasons why products of different kinds of work should be exchanged in this or that proportion. They exchange in this way, Marx tells us, though in slightly different words, because according to experience they do exchange in this way. I remark further in passing that the followers of Marx, having perhaps recognized the circle I have just described, have made the attempt to place the reduction of complicated to simple work on another, a real basis. Quote, "It is no fiction but a fact," end quote, says Grabsky, quote, "that an hour of skilled labor contains several hours of unskilled labor. For, quote, in order to be consistent, we must also take into account the labor which was used in acquiring the skill," end quote. I do not think it will need many words to show clearly the complete inadequacy of this explanation. I have nothing to say against the view that labor in actual operation should be added the quota due to the acquirement of the power to labor. But it is clear that the difference in value of skilled labor as opposed to unskilled labor could only then be explained by reference to this additional quota, if the amount of the latter corresponded to the amount of that difference. For instance, in the case we have given, there could only be actually 5 hours of unskilled labor and 1 hour of skilled labor. If 4 hours of preparatory labor went to every hour of skilled labor, or reckoned in greater units, if out of 50 years of life which a sculptor devotes to the learning and practicing of his profession, he spends 40 years in education in order to do skilled work for 10 years, but no one will maintain that such a proportion or anything approaching it is actually found to exist. I turn therefore again from the obviously inadequate hypothesis of the disciple to the teaching of the master himself in order to illustrate the nature and range of its errors by one other example, which I think will bring out most clearly the fault in Marx's mode of reasoning. With the very same reasoning, one could affirm and argue the proposition that the quantity of material contained in a commodity constitutes the principle and measure of exchange value. The commodities exchange in proportion to the quantity of material incorporated in them. 10 pounds of material in one kind of commodity exchange against 10 pounds of material in another kind of commodity. If the natural objection were raised that this statement was obviously false because 10 pounds of gold do not exchange against 10 pounds of iron, but against 40,000 pounds, or against a still greater number of pounds of coal, We may reply after the manner of Marx that it is the amount of common average material that affects the formation of value that acts as unit of measurement. Skillfully wrought costly material of social special equality counts only as compound or rather multiplied common material, so that a small quantity of material fashioned with skill is equal to a larger quantity of common material. That this reduction is constantly made, experience shows. A commodity may be of the most exquisite material. Its value makes it equal to commodities formed of common material, and therefore represents only a particular quantity of common material. A, quote, social process, end quote, the existence of which cannot be doubted, is persistently reducing the pound of raw gold to 40,000 pounds of raw iron, and the pound of raw silver to 1,500 pounds of raw iron. The working up of the gold by an ordinary goldsmith or by the hand of a great artist gives rise to further variations in the character of the material to which we use. In conformity with experience, does justice by means of special standards of reduction. If 1 pound of bar gold, therefore, exchanges against 40,000 pounds of bar iron, or if a gold cup of the same weight wrought by Benvenuto Cellini exchanges against 4,000,000 pounds of iron, it is not a violation but a confirmation of the proposition that commodities exchange in proportion to the, quote, average, end quote, material they contain. I think the impartial reader will easily recognize once more in these two arguments the two ingredients of the Marxian recipe: the substitution of, quote, to count for, quote, to be, and the explanation in a circle, which consists in obtaining the standard of reduction from the actually existing social exchange relations, which themselves need explanation. In this, Marx has settled his account with the facts that most glaringly contradict his theory with great dialectical skill, certainly, but as far as the matter itself is concerned, naturally and inevitably in a quite inadequate manner. But there are, besides contradictions with actual experience, rather less striking than the foregoing, those, namely, which spring from the part that the investment of capital has in determining the actual price of commodities, the same which Ricardo, as we have already noticed, treats of in the 4th section of the chapter on value. Towards them, Marx adopts a change of tactics. For a time he completely shuts his eyes to them. He ignores them by a process of abstraction through the 1st and 2nd volumes and pretends they do not exist, that is to say, he proceeds throughout the whole detailed exposition of his doctrine of value, and likewise throughout the development of his theory of surplus value, on the, quote, assumption, end quote, in part tacitly maintained, in part clearly asserted, that commodities really exchange according to their values, which means exactly in proportion to the labor embodied in them. This hypothetical abstraction he combines with an uncommonly clever dialectical move. He gives certain actual deviations from the law from which a theorist may really venture to abstract, namely the accidental and temporary fluctuations of the market prices round their normal fixed level. And on the occasions when Marx explains his intention to disregard the deviations of the prices from the values, he does not fail to direct the reader's attention to those, quote, accidental circumstances, end quote, which have to be ignored as the, quote, constant oscillations of the market prices, end quote, whose, quote, rise and fall compensate each other, end quote, and which, quote, reduce themselves to an average price as their inner law, end quote. By this reference he gains the reader's approval of his abstraction, but the fact that he does not abstract merely from accidental fluctuations, but also from regular, permanent, typical deviations, whose existence constitutes an integral part of the rule to be elucidated, is not made manifest to the reader who is not closely observant, and he glides unsuspectingly over the author's fatal error of method. For it is a fatal error of method to ignore in scientific investigation the very point that demands explanation. Now Marx's theory of surplus value aims at nothing less than the explanation, as he conceives it, of the profits of capital. But the profits of capital lie exactly in those regular deviations of the prices of commodities from the amount of their mere costs in labor. If, therefore, we ignore those deviations, we ignore just the principal part of what has to be explained. Rodbertus was guilty of the same error of method, and 12 years ago I taxed him as well as Marx with it, and I venture now to repeat the concluding words of the criticism I then made. Quote, "They, the adherents of the exploitation theory, maintain the law that the value of all commodities rests on the working time embodied in commodities, in order that the next moment they may attack as, quote, opposed to law, end quote, unnatural and, quote, unjust, all forms of value that do not harmonize with this, quote, law, just as the difference in value that falls as surplus to the capitalist, and demand their abolition. Thus they first ignore the exceptions in order to proclaim their law of value as universal. And after thus assuming its universality, they again draw attention to the exceptions in order to brand them as offenses against the law. This kind of argument is very much as if we were to assume that there were many foolish people in the world, and to ignore that there were also many wise ones, and then coming to the, quote, universally valid law, end quote, that, quote, all men are foolish, end quote. Second, should demand the extirpation of the wise on the ground that the existence is obviously, quote, contrary to law, end quote. End quote. Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk. By his maneuver of abstraction, Marx certainly gained a great tactical advantage for his own version of the case. He, quote, by hypothesis, end quote, shut out from his system the disturbing real world, and did not, therefore, so long as he could maintain this exclusion, come into conflict with it, and he does maintain it through the greater part of the first volume, though the whole of the second volume, and through the first quarter of the third volume. In this middle part of the Marxian system, the logical development and connection present a really imposing closeness and intrinsic consistency. Marx is free to use good logic here because by means of hypothesis he has in advance made the facts to square with his ideas, and can therefore be true to the latter without knocking up against the former. And when Marx is free to use sound logic, he does so in a truly masterly way. However wrong the starting point may be, these middle parts of the system, by their extraordinary logical consistency, permanently establish the reputation of the author as an intellectual force of the first rank, and it is circumstance that has served not a little to increase the practical influence of the Marxian system, that during this long middle part of his work, which as far as intrinsic consistency is concerned is really essentially faultless, the readers who have got happily over the difficulties at the beginning get time to accustom themselves to the Marxian world of thought, and to gain confidence in his connection of ideas which here flow so smoothly, one out of the other, and form themselves into such a well-arranged whole. It is on these readers whose confidence has been thus won, that he makes those hard demands which he is at last obliged to bring forward in his third volume. For long as Marx delayed to open his eyes to the facts of real life, he had to do it some time or other. He had at last to confess to his readers that in actual life commodities do not exchange regularly and of necessity in proportion to the working time incorporated in them, but in part exchange above and in part below this proportion, according to the capital invested, demands a smaller or larger amount of the average profit. In short, that, besides working time, investment of capital forms a coordinate determinant of the exchange relation of commodities. From this point, he was confronted with two difficult tasks. In the first place, he had to justify himself to his readers for having in the earlier parts of his work and for so long taught that labor was the sole determinant of exchange relations. And secondly, what was perhaps the more difficult task, he had also to give his readers a theoretical explanation of the facts which were hostile to his theory, an explanation which certainly could not fit into his labor theory of value without leaving a residuum, but which must not, on the other hand, contradict it. One can understand that good straightforward logic could no longer be used in these demonstrations. We now witness the counterpart to the confused beginning of the system. There Marx had to do violence to facts in order to deduce a theorem which could not be straightforwardly deduced from facts. And he had to do still greater violence to logic and commit the most incredible fallacies into the bargain. Now the situation repeats itself. Now again the propositions which through 2 volumes have been in undisturbed possession of the field come into collision with the facts with which they are mutually as little in agreement as they were before. Nevertheless, the harmony of the system has to be maintained, and it can only be maintained at the cost of the logic. The Marxian system, therefore, presents us now with a spectacle at first sight strange, but under circumstances described quite natural, namely that by far the greater part of the system is a masterpiece of close and forcible logic worthy of the intellect of its author, but that in 2 places, and those, alas, just the most decisive places, incredibly weak and careless reasoning is inserted. The first place is just at the beginning, when the theory first separates itself from the facts, and the second is after the first quarter of the 3rd volume, when facts are again brought in within the horizon of the reader. I here refer more especially to the 10th chapter of the 3rd volume. We have already become acquainted with one part of its contents, and we have subjected it to our criticism, the part, namely, where Marx defends himself against the accusation that there is a contradiction between the law of the price of production and the, quote, law of value. It still remains, however, to glance at the second object which the chapter is concerned, the explanation with which Marx introduces into his system that theory of the price of production which takes account of actual conditions. This consideration leads us also to one of the most instructive and most characteristic points of the Marxian system, the position of, quote, competition, end quote, in the system. Section 3. Quote, competition, end quote, as I have already hinted, is a sort of collective name for all the psychical motives and impulses which determine the action of the dealers in the market, and which thus influence the fixing of prices. The buyer has his motives which actuate him in buying, and which provide him with a certain guide as to the prices which he is prepared to offer either at once or in the last resort. And the seller and the producer are also actuated by certain motives which determine the seller to part with his commodities at a certain price and not at another price, and the producer to continue and even to extend his production when prices reach a certain level, or to suspend it when they are at a different level. In the competition between buyer and seller, all these motives and determinants encounter each other, and whoever refers to competition to explain the formation of prices appeals in effect to what under a collective name is the active play of all the psychical impulses and motives which had directed both sides of the market. Marx is now for the most part engaged in the endeavor to give to competition and the forces operating in competition the lowest possible place in his system, he either ignores it, or if he does not do this, he tries to belittle the manner and degree of its influence where and whenever he can. This is shown in a striking way on several occasions. First of all, he does this when he deduces his law that value is wholly labor. Every impartial person knows and sees that influence which the quantity of labor employs exerts on the permanent level of prices of goods, an influence not really so special and peculiar to the Marxian law of value makes it appear, peculiar as the Marxian law of value makes it appear, acts only through the play of supply and demand, that is to say, through competition. In the case of exceptional exchanges, or in the case of monopoly, prices may come into existence which, even apart from the claim of the capital invested, are out of all proportion to the working time incorporated. Marx naturally knows this too, but he makes no reference to it in his deduction of the law of value. If he had referred to it, then he would have been unable to put aside the question in what way and by what intermediate steps working time should come to be the sole influence determining the height of prices among all the motives and factors which play their part under the flag of competition. The complete analysis of those motives, which then could not have been avoided, would inevitably have placed the value in use much more in the foreground than would have suited Marx, and would have cast a different light on many things, and finally would have revealed much to which Marx did not wish to allow any weight in his system. And so, on the very occasion when, in order to give a complete and systematic explanation of his law of value, it would have been his duty to have shown the part which competition plays as intermediary, he passes away from the point without a word. Later on he does notice it, but to judge from the place and the manner, not as if it were an important point in the theoretical system. In some casual and cursory remarks, he alludes to competition in a few words as something that more or less explains itself, and he does not trouble himself to go further into it. I think that the said facts about competition are most clearly and concisely set forth by Marx in page 209 of the third volume, where the exchange of commodities at prices which approximate to their, quote, values, end quote, and correspond therefore to the working time incorporated in them, is said to be subject to the three following conditions. 1. That the exchange of commodities be not merely an, quote, accidental or occasional one, end quote. 2. That commodities, quote, on both sides should be produced in quantities nearly proportionate to the reciprocal demand, which itself results from the experience of both sides of the market, and which therefore grows as a result out of a sustained exchange itself, end quote. And 3, quote, that no natural or artificial monopoly should give to either of the contracting parties the power to sell above the value, or should force either of them to sell below the value, end quote. And so what Marx demands as a condition of his law of value coming into operation is a brisk competition on both sides, which should have lasted long enough to adjust production relatively to the needs of the buyer according to the experience of the market. We must bear this passage well in mind. No more detailed proof is added. On the contrary, a little later, indeed, just in the middle of those arguments in which, relatively speaking, he treats most exhaustively of competition, its two sides of demand and supply, and its relation to the fixing of prices, Marx expressly declines a, quote, deeper analysis of these two social impelling forces, end quote, as, quote, not apposite here, end quote. But this is not all. In order to belittle the importance for the theoretical system of supply and demand, and perhaps also to justify his neglect of these factors, Marx thought out a peculiar and remarkable theory which he develops on pages 223 to 224 of the third volume after some previous slight allusions to it. He starts by saying that when one of the two factors preponderates over the other, demand over supply, for instance, or vice versa, irregular market prices are formed which deviate from the, quote, market value, end quote, which constitutes the, quote, point of equilibrium, end quote, for these market prices, that on the other hand, if commodities should sell at this their normal market value, demand and supply must exactly balance each other. And to that he adds the following remarkable argument. If demand and supply balance each other, they cease to act. If two forces act equally in opposite directions, they cancel each other out. They produce no result, and the phenomenon occurring under these conditions must be explained by some other agency than either of these forces. If supply and demand cancel each other out, they cease to explain anything. They do not affect the market value, and they leave us altogether in the dark as to the reasons why the market value should express itself in just this and no other sum of money, end quote. The relation of demand to supply can be rightly used to explain the, quote, deviations from the market value, end quote, which are due to the preponderance of one force over the other, but not the level of the market value itself. That this curious theory squared with the Marxian system is obvious. If the relation of supply to demand had absolutely no bearing on the level of permanent prices, then Marx was quite right in laying down his principles not to trouble himself further with this unimportant factor, and straightway to introduce into his system the factor which in his opinion exercised a real influence on the degree of value, that is, labor. It is, however, not less obvious, I think, that this curious theory is absolutely false. Its reasoning rests, as is so often the case with Marx, on a play upon words. It is quite true that when a commodity sells at its normal market value, supply and demand must in a certain sense balance each other. That is to say, at this price, just the same quantity of the commodity is effectively demanded as is offered. But this is not only the case when commodities are sold at a normal market value, but at whatever market value they are sold, even when it is a varying irregular one. Moreover, everyone knows quite well, as does Marx himself, that supply and demand are elastic quantities. In addition to the supply and demand which enters into exchange, there is always a, quote, excluded, end quote, demand or supply, that is, a number of people who equally desire the commodity for their needs, but who will not or cannot offer the prices offered by their stronger competitors, and a number of people who are also prepared to offer the desired commodities, only at higher prices than can be obtained in the then state of the market. But saying that demand and supply, quote, balance each other, end quote, does not apply absolutely to the total demand and supply, but only to the successful part of demand and supply. It is well known, however, that the business of the market consists precisely in selecting the successful part out of the total demand and the total supply, and that the most important means to this selection is the fixing of price. More commodities cannot be bought than sold. Hence, on the two sides, only a certain fixed number of reflectors for only a certain fixed number of commodities can arrive at a focus. The selection of this number is accomplished by the automatic advance of prices to a point which excludes the excess to... The selection of this number is accomplished by the automatic advance of prices to a point which excludes the excess in number on both sides, so that the price is at the same time too high for the excess of the would-be buyers and too low for the excess of the would-be sellers. It is not, therefore, the successful competitors only who take part in determining the level of prices, but the respective circumstances of those who are excluded have a share in it as well. And on that account, on no other, it is wrong to argue the complete suspension of the action of supply and demand from the equilibrium of the part which comes effectively into the market. But it is wrong also for another reason, assuming that it is only the successful part of supply and demand, being in quantitative equilibrium, that affects the fixing of price. It is quite erroneous and unscientific to assume that forces which hold each other in equilibrium therefore, quote, cease to act, end quote. On the contrary, the state of equilibrium is precisely the result of their action, and when an explanation has to be given of this state of equilibrium with all its details, one of the most prominent of which is the height of the level in which the equilibrium was found, it certainly cannot be given, quote, in some other way than by the agency of the two forces, end quote. On the contrary, it is only by the agency of the forces which maintain the equilibrium that it can be explained. But such abstract propositions can best be illustrated by a principal example. Suppose we send up an air balloon. Everybody knows that a balloon rises if and because it is filled with a gas which is thinner than the atmosphere. It does not rise immediately, however, but only to a certain height. It does not rise indefinitely, however, but only to a certain height, where it remains floating so long as nothing occurs, such as an escape of gas, to alter the conditions. Now, how is the degree of altitude regulated, and by what factor is it determined? This is transparently evident. The density of the atmosphere diminishes as we rise. The balloon rises only so long as the density of the surrounding stratum of atmosphere is greater than its own density, and it ceases to rise when its own density and the density of the atmosphere hold each other in equipoise. The less dense the gas, therefore, the higher the balloon will rise, and the higher the stratum of air in which it finds the same degree of atmospheric density. It is obvious under these circumstances, therefore, that the height to which the balloon rises cannot be explained in any other way than by considering the relative density of the balloon on one side and of the atmosphere on the other. How does the matter appear, however, from the Marxian point of view? At a certain height, both forces, density of the balloon and density of the surrounding air, are in equipoise. They therefore, quote, cease to act, end quote. They, quote, cease to explain anything, end quote. They do not affect the degree of ascent, and if we wish to explain this, we must do it by, quote, something else than the agency of these two forces, end quote. Quote, indeed, end quote, we say, quote, by what then? End quote. Or again, when the index of a weighing machine points to 100 pounds when a body is being weighed, how are we to account for the position of the index of the weighing machine? We are not to account for it by the relation of the weight of the body to be weighed on the one side with the weights which serve in the weighing machine on the other. For these two forces, then, the index of the weighing machine is the proposition referred to, hold each other in equipoise. They therefore cease to act, and nothing can be explained from their relationship, not even the position of the index of the weighing machine. I think the fallacy here is obvious, and that it is not less obvious that the same kind of fallacy lies at the root of the arguments by which Marx reasons away the influence of supply and demand on the level of permanent prices. Let there be no misunderstanding, however. It is by no means my opinion that a really complete and satisfying explanation of the fixing of permanent prices is contained in a reference to the formula of supply and demand. On the contrary, the opinion which I have elsewhere often expressed at length is that the elements which can only be roughly comprehended under the term, quote, supply and demand, end quote, ought to be closely examined, and the manner and measure of their reciprocal influence exactly defined, and that in this way we should proceed to the attainment of the knowledge of those elements which exert a special influence on the state of prices. But the influence of the relation of supply and demand, which Marx reasons away, is an indispensable link in this further and more profound explanation. It is not a side issue, but one that goes to the heart of the subject. Let us take up again the threads of our argument. Various things have shown us how hard Marx tries to make the influence of supply and demand retire into the background of his system. And now, at the remarkable turn which his system takes after the first quarter of the third volume, he is confronted by the task of explaining why the permanent prices... Let us take up again the threads of our argument. Various things have shown us how hard Marx tries to make the influence of supply and demand retire into the background of his system, and now at the remarkable turn which his system takes after the first quarter of the third volume, he is confronted by the task of explaining why the permanent prices of commodities do not gravitate towards the incorporated quantity of labor, but towards the, quote, price of production, end quote, which deviate from it. The prices of production which deviate from it. Marx declares competition to be the force which causes this. Competition reduces the original rates of profit, which were different for the different branches of production according to the different organic compositions of the capitals, to a common average rate of profit. And consequently, the prices must in the long run gravitate towards the prices of production, yielding the one equal average profit. Let us hasten to settle some points which are important to the understanding of this explanation. First, it is certain that a reference to competition is in effect nothing else than a reference to the action of supply and demand. In the passage already mentioned, in which Marx describes most concisely the process of the equalization of the rates of profit by the competition of capitals, he expressly says that this process is brought about by, quote, such a relation of supply to demand that the average profit is made equal in the different spheres of production, and that therefore values change into prices of production, end quote. Secondly, it is certain that, as regards this process, it is not a question of mere fluctuations around the center of gravitation contemplated in the theory of the first two volumes, that is, around the incorporated working time, but a question of a definite forcing of prices to another permanent center of gravity, the price of production. And now question follows on question. If, according to Marx, the relation of supply and demand exerts no influence at all on the level of permanent price, how can competition, which is identical with this relation, be the power which shifts the level of the permanent prices from the level of, quote, value, end quote, to a level so different, that of the price of production? Do we not rather see in this forced and inconsistent appeal to competition as the des ex machina, which drives the permanent prices from that center of gravitation, which is in keeping with the theory of embodied labor, to another, an involuntary confession that the social forces which govern actual life contain in themselves and bring into action some elementary determinants of exchange relations which cannot be reduced to working time, and that consequently the analysis of the original theory which yielded working time alone as the basis of exchange relations was an incomplete one which did not correspond with the facts. And further, Marx has told us himself, and we have carefully noted the passage, that commodities exchange approximately to their values only when a brisk competition exists. Thus he, at that time, appealed to competition as a factor which tends to push the prices of commodities towards their values, And now we learn, on the contrary, that competition is a force which pushes the prices of commodities away from their values and on to their prices of production. These statements, moreover, are found in one and the same chapter, the 10th chapter, destined, it would seem, to an unhappy notoriety. Can they be reconciled? And if Marx perhaps thought he could find a reconciliation in the view that one position applied to primitive conditions and the other to developed modern society, must we not point out to him that in the first chapter of his work he did not deduce his theory that value was wholly labor from a Robinsonade, but from the conditions of a society in which a capitalist mode of production prevails, and the, quote, wealth, end quote, of which, quote, appears as an immense collection of commodities, end quote. And does he not demand of us throughout his whole book that we should view the conditions of our modern society in the light of his theory of labor and judge them by it? But when we ask where, according to his own statements, we are to seek in modern society for the region in which his law of value is enforced, we ask in vain. For either there is no competition, in which case commodities do not at all exchange according to their values, says Marx, or competition exists, and precisely then, he states, they still less exchange according to their values, but according to their prices of production. And so, in the uncomfortable 10th chapter, contradiction is heaped upon contradiction. I will not prolong the already lengthy inquiry by counting up all the lesser contradictions and inaccuracies with which the chapter abounds. I think every one who reads the chapter with an impartial mind will get the impression that the writing is, so to speak, demoralized. Instead of the severe, pregnant, careful style, instead of the iron logic to which we are accustomed in the most brilliant parts of Marx's work, we have here an uncertain and desultory manner, not only in the reasoning, but even in the use of technical terms. How striking, for instance, is the constantly changing conception of the terms supply and demand, which at one time are presented to us quite rightly as elastic quantities, with differences of intensity, but at another are regarded, after the worst manner of a long exploded, quote, vulgar economy, end quote, as simple quantities. Or how unsatisfactory and inconsistent is the description of the factors which govern the market value. If the different portions of the mass of commodities which come into the market are created under unequal conditions of production, etc. The explanation of this feature of the chapter cannot be found simply in the fact that it was written by Marx when he was growing old, for even in later parts there are many splendid written arguments, and even this unfortunate chapter, of which obscure hints were already scattered here and there in the first volume, must have been thought out earlier. Marx's writing is confused and vacillating here because he could not venture to write clearly and definitely without open contradiction and retraction. If at the same time, when he was dealing with actual exchange relations, those manifested in real life, he had pursued the subject with the same luminous penetration and thoroughness with which he followed through 2 volumes the hypothesis that value is labor to its utmost logical conclusion. If at this juncture he had given to the important term, quote, competition, end quote, a scientific import, by a careful economic psychological analysis of the social motive forces which come into action under that comprehensive name, if he had not halted or rested so long as a link in the argument remained unexplained, or a consequence not carried to its logical conclusion, or so long as one relation appeared dark and contradictory, and almost every word of this 10th chapter challenges a deeper inquiry or explanation such as this, he would have been driven step by step to the exposition of a system altogether different in purport from that of his original system, nor would he have been able to avoid the open contradiction and withdrawal of the main proposition of the original system. This could only be avoided by confusion and mystification. Marx must often instinctively have felt this, even if he did not know it, when he expressly declined the deeper analysis of the social motive forces. I was waiting to that paragraph was to be done just to say this, but Böhm-Bawerk is talking as if Capital Volume 3 was written after Capital Volume 1. But to my understanding, well, if I was to say, to my knowledge, if I was feeling a little more dickish, the bulk of what we know as Volume 3 of Capital comes from Marx's economic manuscripts of 1864 to 5 or 1863 to 65. So the bulk of Volume 3 was written before Volume 1, to my understanding. Look it up if you don't believe me. Or, because maybe I'm wrong. Who knows? I'm just a asshole fucking talking. Herein lies, I believe, the alpha and omega of all that is fallacious, contradictory, and vague in the treatment of his subject by Marx. His system is not in close touch with facts. Marx has not deduced from facts the fundamental principles of his system, either by means of a sound empiricism or a solid economico-psychological analysis. He founds it on no firmer ground than a formal dialectic. This is the great radical fault of the Marxian system at its birth. From it all rests necessarily. Well, this is the great radical fault of the Marxian system at its birth. From it all the rest necessarily springs. The system runs in one direction, facts go in another, and they cross the course of the system, sometimes here, sometimes there. On each occasion, the original fault begets a new fault. The conflict of system and facts must be kept from view, so that the matter is shrouded either in darkness or vagueness, or it is turned and twisted with the same tricks of dialectic as at the outset. Or, where none of this avails, we have a contradiction. Such is the character of the 10th chapter of Marx's 3rd volume. It brings the long-deferred bad harvest, which grew by necessity out of the bad seed.